When we put together the Rich States, Poor States publication about 6 years ago now with Art Laffer, famed economist, and Steve Moore from the Wall Street Journal, we wanted to basically put together a guide for America's state legislators who are ALEC members and all state legislators as to what are we think the policies that matter the most across our 50 laboratories of democracy, as Justice Brandeis would put it. And just a little bit about ALEC is, we're the nation's largest nonpartisan membership organization of state legislators. We've been around for about 40 years. And we've had this concept of, what's the exchange of good ideas from one state to another? And we subscribe to the Jeffersonian policy of limited government, lower taxes, and federalism, that oft-forgotten word that we really don't know anything about in Washington, D.C. these days. When we talk about federalism in D.C., generally it's talking about how do we expand the federal government. It's not the interaction, of course, of the 10th Amendment explanation of federalism. And so when we put this index together 6 years ago, Art Laffer and Steve Moore and I sat down and wanted to see what can we isolate out as being what we think are the most important policy variables that we think are predictive going forward, that put in place the correct incentives that legislators actually have some sort of say over that will make each state's economy more competitive going forward. Because whether we acknowledge it or not, there is a competition, a very fierce competition going on among the states for capital, both investment capital and human capital. And as we'll talk a little bit about today, we see a very, very strong correlation out there between what's happening in state capitals when it comes to policy and what's happening when it comes to the flows of capital. And I think what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the three major themes of Rich States, Poor States, which are tax policy, which are spending, and which are pensions. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how New York ranks in those areas. Now, any of you that have done a little homework ahead of time will know that we rank New York 50th out of 50, with 50 being last, not first, unfortunately. You're probably expecting me to come and give a full economist doom and gloom presentation about New York. That's not quite the case. I think that there's opportunity. I mean, there's nowhere to go but up, right, if you're at number 50. So what I'd like to talk is, the nice thing is there's also nothing set in stone when it comes to states. Over the last 6 years that we've been working on this project, there's been quite a bit of movement among the states in terms of states that are able to get things right and move from a very uncompetitive position. And then some states that were in the top 10 have moved down because of poor policy making and some of the challenges it's faced. And of course, every state's faced challenges, especially since the national downturn. Obviously, on average, the state recovery generally lags a national economic recovery by a couple of years, is our historical precedent. We haven't, of course, had a very strong national recovery at this point either. And so many states have really had to hit the reset button when it comes to how we operate at the state capitol. Obviously, at the state level, there's no printing presses. There's balanced budget amendments in most states that at least are somewhat casually observed in at least most states, much more so than D.C. And so I think it makes it more incumbent upon state legislators to actually get to the bottom of financial issues when it comes to balancing a budget on a yearly basis. Now, on the spending side of the equation, now it's very interesting to see what's happened. State and local governments have obviously had to pare back since 2009, as the budgets have been really impacted significantly in many cases. But what is very telling, I think, is what has led up to the crash of 2008 and 2009 and what really precipitated these major budget shortfalls in the states. It was the fact that in that decade, state and local government spending grew 90% faster than the private sector over that decade alone, 90% faster than the private sector. And so when the crash came, it exacerbated those structural issues of government spending much quicker than the private sector economy that is there to fund government. Now, when you take a look at what most states do on the spending side, and this is a little bit disturbing, is many times they'll just take last year's budget, add a percentage growth rate, caseload increase, and therefore get a next year's budget, where in many cases now today we're seeing states reevaluate that approach, which I think is a very positive step, and take a more of a look at a holistic priority-based budget to say what are the priorities of government, what are the things that state government exists to do? What are the things that maybe the private sector can do better? What are the things that maybe other levels of government can do better and more effectively? And focus focus on those things instead of automatically giving a rate of growth increase there. I won't spend too much time on the budgeting side, but the biggest threat to state finances, in my view, is the huge unfunded liabilities facing the states when it comes to pensions. And I really should include in there, especially after EJ's fine piece on the OPEB benefits of other post-employment benefits, the liabilities there are stark. I mean, I think it was $250 billion here in OPEB that report suggests. And unfortunately, states have been way behind in terms of their accounting standards for pensions, and especially the OPEB benefits, accounting for how big the liabilities are likely to be. And so when it looks when we look to the future to say how do states become more competitive, how do they keep their business climates conducive to growth, the biggest threat there is these huge unfunded liabilities in the areas that really threaten proactive, more competitive policies going forward. Now, we've seen movement from all sides of the political equation at this point, on pensions especially, to tackle the issue and it's really becoming an issue of financial reality in many cases for states. These gentlemen here, one thing that they do have in common, they're not Republicans. They're certainly not far-right individuals in many cases. Of course, Willie Brown, former liberal Speaker of the House of California. But all of these gentlemen have admitted and really spent significant time on the problem of unfunded liabilities in state and local pension systems and how it threatens public education going forward, how it threatens state finances, how it threatens to really increase taxes going forward if things are not done properly here. Now, there are some new accounting rules coming out from the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. I don't know how many ardent followers of GASB we have in the room today. If we do, it'd make me feel good. You know, I'm a tax economist, and so when I'm around folks that follow GASB, it makes me look like I actually have a personality, so it makes me feel very good. You all know the difference between an introverted tax economist and an extroverted tax economist, right? The introverted tax economist looks at his shoes when he talks to you, but the extroverted tax economist, on the other hand, looks at your shoes when he talks to you. So that's the world that I come from, and I apologize for that. But I'd like to say one thing about pensions where we're still not being level, we're not close to being level with taxpayers, is the fact that most states have an assumed rate of return in their pension funds of around 8%. That's about the median assumed rate of return across the states today. Now, if we were to take an 8% rate of return, start in January of 2000, and use a compound 8% rate of return in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, for instance, today we would be at Dow nearly 30,000. Now, anybody check the Dow this morning? You know, I don't think we're anywhere close to that. Now, the problem is you know, we just aren't realizing the huge liabilities that's there yet, and that's a real concern for us going forward. And I'll stop at that. The other side, of course, of the equation is tax policy. And in rich states, poor states, we spend quite a good deal of our time on tax rates, marginal tax rates. We believe, as my good friend David Turk has gone over for years now, how much marginal tax rates matter for growth. The incentives that they put in place, or the disincentives in the case of high marginal tax rates, that they put in place for businesses and individuals to move to a state and to do business in a state are huge. We want to make sure that we highlight, obviously, as much as we can, that type of impact that it has on state competitiveness. Now, I think it's also important to say it not only matters how much you tax, but it matters the manner that you go about collecting the tax revenue. What are the most effective ways of raising tax revenue? What are the most damaging ways, on the other hand, of collecting tax revenue? And this is something that most economists will also agree on. This is something that's not just a right-wing talking point. So organizations as diverse as the OECD, for instance, that follow the developed countries around the world, have come out and said you need to reduce reliance on capital-based taxes. You need to tax consumption. You do not want to tax capital because of the risk of capital flight and just how mobile capital is today. And so, therefore, with some of the basis we have in what we've studied in tax policy at ALEC, we've developed and boiled it down to really, I think, 5 good tax policy principles. Simplicity, transparency, neutrality, which is avoiding picking winners and losers, predictability, which is key when it comes to business planning, as we'll hear from our friends at the Business Council and NFIB. And also, finally, the most important principle, I think, of tax policy is the competitiveness factor, where you can get all the rest right, but if you do not get the competitiveness factor right, it really doesn't move the ball forward that much in a state. And that's what Rich States, Poor States is all about, is competitiveness. Now, another basic that we refer to time and time again in Rich States, Poor States that has had implications in the economy, in the world of economy and of economics over the last decades, is the Laffer Curve, which my co-author Arthur Laffer allegedly during a cocktail party on a napkin put together the concept, which is basically showing the effects of incentives on tax revenue, on economic growth. And when we find among states, and Rich States, Poor States obviously, people are more mobile now than ever, capital is more mobile. It's awfully easy to change your residency from one state to another, much easier than changing your citizenship, for instance, and going somewhere abroad. But as we see, people move, they move very frequently among states, businesses do as well. And it really gets back to the Laffer Curve and the revenue and the economic growth effects of people changing their behavior based on taxes. Now, this has been ridiculed by some on the left for years as being voodoo economics and many other things. It's been called pejoratively. But at the basic level of the Laffer Curve, it's a very important principle of how incentives matter. At a 0% marginal tax rate, how much revenue do you raise? That's the easy part of the equation. At the other parts where the controversy is a little bit, at a 100% marginal tax rate, how much revenue can you expect to raise for the government? Zero, right? Anybody willing to work for the privilege of paying taxes? Usually doesn't happen. So then, of course, therefore, somewhere in the middle, you're going to have your growth maximizing point, your revenue maximizing point. That's where it gets a little fuzzy for some people. But at the basic level, this shows how much incentives matter. And it's a pretty tough thing to refute, just logically speaking. Now, there's some out there who will suggest that weather plays a bigger factor in migration of population across states than taxes does. I thought that was maybe a joke when they first came out with it. Unfortunately, it wasn't. They actually, Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, a liberal think tank in Washington, D.C., put this report out. A couple of the places I've been to over the last year that I really didn't ever want to leave because of the beaches and the weather, for instance, Hawaii, Maui's average temperature 84 degrees, San Diego 71 throughout the year. Now, what's happening in these beautiful places with great weather, though? Very interestingly enough, Hawaii has actually lost more Americans than it has gained 8 out of the last 10 years, net domestic migration. California, it's a very interesting point, had been really the growth engine, as EJ was talking about, for years. Now, over the last 10 years, 1.5 million Americans have moved out of the state of California, more than have moved in. And of course, New York is facing a very similar phenomenon, even more dramatically in net domestic migration. Now, of course, what has changed? Nothing's really changed about the beaches. Why are people starting to leave California? Now, the other thing is about when we talk about redistricting, this is something that obviously New York doesn't know anything about, right? You don't have to redraw lines or anything recently. Every state obviously has been pretty consumed with this process. And this is the logical outcome of, and really you pay the penalty for congressional representation every time you lose population. And the states that are gaining population, like Texas, which gained 4 new congressional seats in the last 10 years because of the huge population boom, are really reaping the benefit. Now, if you look at the last 50 years, and I noticed the report by Empire talking about the graying of New York and just how the population has aged. You haven't been getting the folks coming into New York. It was incredible. When I go across the country and give this presentation, people really are surprised to see that New York has lost that many congressional districts, 14 congressional districts since 1960 because of the population outflow. It's incredible. I mean, Pennsylvania is the only one that's close to that in terms of matching the population outflow. Now, one thing also to mention is that California didn't gain a seat this round of redistricting, which is a very interesting phenomenon. First time since statehood that California has not gained a seat in redistricting this year. So it's a very interesting implication there. One of the key points, as I mentioned, is marginal tax rate. So I want to go through a comparison for you real quickly here. And this is the 9 states with the highest marginal tax rates, which unfortunately New York finds itself, and then the states without personal income taxes. And what we do is we take a look at 10 years worth of gross state product growth. We find that the states with the highest personal income taxes have grown a little over than 40% over the last 10 years, 42%, and the states without income taxes at the personal level have grown nearly 60% over the last 10 years, a 25% growth premium roughly, which is obviously huge on gross state product growth. Population growth, as the concept is people vote with their feet towards climates, business climates, towards areas of opportunity. And it happens that people are voting very strongly with their feet to the states without income taxes, almost 14% population growth over the last 10 years compared to about 5.5% in the states with the highest. And then this one is a little bit counterintuitive to some, because they would say that you need to have a high marginal income tax rate to raise revenue. It's about 45% tax receipt growth in the states with the highest income taxes. The states with the without income taxes, look at that, almost double, 82% revenue growth over the last 10 years. Which is really the Laffer Curve effect in action today, showing that these states are in many cases do get the benefits of energy and some things like that. However, it doesn't explain that type of a 2-to-1 revenue growth over the last 10 years. And then finally, job growth, which is something that every state legislator has had on their minds over the last years. Negative job growth in the states with the highest income taxes, but the states without income taxes, nearly 5.5% job growth over the last 10 years. That to say, we think income taxes are some of the most damaging forms of taxes to raise at the state level. We think that's why we have a couple of our variables in rich states, poor states related to directly related to the marginal income tax rate of state and local governments. And that really is one of the factors why New York ranks so poorly in our index. Now, New York has consistently ranked poorly in our Rich States, Poor States Index over all 5 years of this book. The best that you've done is 49th, which was in our first edition, and then you've been consistently 50th for the last 4. Now, marginal tax rates certainly matter, especially when you add on the city tax to what you've got at the state level. Also, what matters, property taxes are in the worst 10 in the nation in terms of personal income as a percentage of personal income. Also, with the state level estate tax, many states have looked to scrap their state level estate and inheritance taxes over the last 10 years. The recently legislated tax increases that happened a couple of years back, we do a 2-year look-back window, so we look back at 2010, and we saw many tax increases, obviously, that year. And so New York actually ranks 3rd worst nationally in terms of the recently legislated tax changes. And then finally, very large, obviously, public employee sector, where you have in the bottom 10, roughly 43rd out of the 50 states there in terms of public employees per 10,000 population, non-right-to-work state. I'm not going to say much about the labor policy side of it, but the fact of the matter is when you talk to the folks in Indiana that enacted right to work this last session, there were many businesses that will just say we're not going to go and expand into a state unless it's a right to work state. And that's why you see so many states moving towards that direction, and you see kind of the results coming out of the states that have already enacted it. And so just in summary, Rich States, Poor States is just one tool. I mean, it measures 15 variables. You're going to hear from my friend David Turek, who has a little different take on it. But I think the point that EJ made was really the key point here, is that you don't have to take just the ALEC Rich States, Poor States ranking and take it as gospel. But as you go across the various indices out there that measure different things, some predictive and some backwards looking, and seeing that correlation among Tax Foundation, among our rankings, among some of the others that look especially at the incentive side of it. What are the cost drivers? What are the incentives that businesses would face if they want to invest in New York versus another state? And see that New York's track record is consistently below average and in many cases towards the bottom few states in the nation, that's certainly something of concern. And I think Rich States, Poor States lays out a roadmap in some of the areas that what you can do to improve. And like I said, this is not all doom and gloom here. there are opportunities to make yourself more competitive, and I think that you'll hear more about those from some of the folks here in the business community, and we're going to talk about that. But thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.